So, okay, so you've got a magazine, you've got memberships. When did the parts element start to happen?
We learned quickly publishing the magazine. By the fourth year, we hired someone to be a layout and design artist because we really weren't artists. And so the parts really didn't start until about 1978.
Okay.
So we had been around for about 4 years. And again, it was a real hunt and peck kind of a situation. There's a certain mentality that you have when you belong to a club. And it was really from the members that we began to become acquainted with. Initially, before we started doing parts, we started doing an annual international convention.
Okay.
The very first one was held in Little Rock, Arkansas. And I think the second one was in Columbus, Ohio. What was interesting was people would show up, and back in those days, a swap meet was the place that you would find parts to restore your car. There were a number of things that were still available from GM, but very minimal. And lenses and gaskets and small trinkets, rubber, none of that stuff, or most of it, was no longer available because by 1978, when we began to do our first parts, the cars you can see from 1955 to 78, you're 20-some years old. And so there was a desperate need. And by the time we started doing parts, we were probably up to around 8,000 or 9,000 members. And what was happening was there were all these articles we would write. We'd find stashes of parts. Guys would go to old Chevrolet dealerships and buy out all their parts and bring them to the swap meet. Then we had the confrontation of a club and a business.
Yeah.
And we had to answer the question, are we a club and a business? Are we a business and a club? Well, we'd started as a club, to begin with. And people were complaining. For example, we had a gentleman that attended one of our very first conventions, and he had a brand new 1955 or 57, don't remember which, shop manual, and he was asking $25 for it. Well, back in 1976, 75, 76, that was a lot of money to pay for a manual. And so we had letters to the editor, and there was this discussion about how in the world should we do this because they were charging so much money for all these parts. And so what happened was, to begin with, we weren't really getting into parts, but we were kind of a buffer between the buyers and the sellers.
Okay.
But there were no new parts. It was just stuff that people had collected. And so it was just by happenstance that we'd done a lot of research up in Detroit. And so in the early magazines, we did a lot of technical articles, publishing what the color codes were and how to decipher a cull tag, how to decipher a vehicle identification number. And so we began to do that, but it wasn't long before the hobbyists really began to clamor. Let's do something. We needed something. So we literally projected the idea of, well, should we make a few parts? And one of the first things that we ever did was offer a lens gasket set for the 1955, 56, and 57 Chevy. They were cheap. We didn't know what we were doing. We were not trained businessmen, but we did figure out that there were companies out there that would do that. And so those were the first things we did.
Which lenses?
Pardon?
Which lenses?
And then we followed that with the lenses. The first lenses we did were the 57 turn signal lenses on the front, the round ones.
Okay.
We found a company that did injection molding, and and we were off. But the real learning came when it came time to figure out what to do, because we realized if you were going to restore a 55, 6, and 7 Chevy, you had to have a shop manual. And they simply weren't out there. This was long before the days of the internet. Maybe you'd find something in an old Motors manual, but Chevrolet had discontinued the shop manual years before that. And there were no companies out there that did just literature. Eventually, there became companies like that. But we had been to Detroit, And we had managed to find some original, very nice, Chevrolet shop manuals. And so we literally took them to a local printer here in Orlando, the printer that had been printing our magazine every month.
Yep.
And he knew we were faithful. He knew we paid our bills every month. But we just didn't have the money. We were still teaching school. Actually, by that time, we had both stepped down, but we were still new. And we still, whatever we paid ourselves was quite minimal.
Yeah.
And we just didn't know what to do. So we went to the printing company that printed our magazine every month, and we told the printing company, we have this harebrained idea. We have been given a copyright release for free from General Motors, specifically to reproduce the shop manuals, 1955, 6, and 7.
Was that hard to do?
It really wasn't. I'll be honest. Let me take a break here and say this. Ford had always encouraged the hobbyist.
Huh.
Ford had a different corporate philosophy. They were a more privately held company started by a single man that in the early years drove it. Henry was smart enough to create his own museum where he put his cars in.
Yeah.
Chevrolet didn't do that. Ford's corporate philosophy was a guy that buys an old Ford from us in a few years wants to buy another. And we want to encourage not only the current buyer, but the old guy. And so Ford, philosophically, from our observation point, seemed to be much more helpful to the hobbyist.
Huh.
And so we were hoping that Chevrolet would do that for us. We began to question General Motors. We had friends there that we had made over the years doing research and archives. We knew a few GM executives, but most of them were always overlooking their shoulder because in a corporate philosophy like GM, the total focus was not the past, but the future.
Right.
What can we sell to you tomorrow?
Correct.
We politicked and politicked and politicked, John. And I'll never forget, we finally got an audience with Mr. Lou Kalouche, who at the time was head of GM Parts Division. His office was in Flint, Michigan. We had done enough research. We actually knew where the tooling was for the backup light assemblies for the 1957. Wow. We knew where the backup lights for the 55 and 6 were. It was a company called Howell and Company. We found the company that made them for GM and had been making them until recently. So we knew where the tooling was. We found where the tooling was for the 1955 Chevrolet front fenders. And so we requested an audience with Mr. Kalouche. Eventually, we had an appointment with him. We flew to Michigan, and we walked in to meet with Mr. Kalouche. And we walked in. We were loaded for bear. We had our magazines that we were publishing. By that time, we were up to about 14,000 members. And we said we represent a big audience of GM. We calculated that our average member owned at least 2 or 3 Chevrolets.
Wow.
And so we sat down with Mr. Kalouche. We're young, we're dumb, we're naive. We think Chevrolet wants us to be around. They love us. Look at what we're doing.
Right.
Look at this free advertising we're doing for them all the time in a Chevrolet magazine. We gave them copies of our magazine. We told them where the tooling was. We brought a bank letter of credit. And we had one request. We simply said, Mr. Kalouche, please, we will buy every part that you make. If you'll just stop, don't discontinue these 3 parts. You still have the tooling. At that time, John, we could buy through our local Chevrolet dealership a 1955 Fender for $65.
Oh, jeez.
And you
That's
could
crazy.
buy the license light assemblies very inexpensively, but GM was discontinuing them. So we gave him the best shot we had in the world. As we got near the end, I'm thinking, man, we've done a good job.
Right.
And I'll never forget, he had this beautiful, gorgeous, fancy office, leather chairs, plush. When we finished, he sat back in his chair, looked at us, thought a few moments, and I'll never forget exactly what he said. He looked at us and he said, boys, I'll be damned if I'm going to make GMPD into an old parts warehouse.
Wow.
And we stood up, shook his hand, walked out of that office with a tail between our legs and said, dadgummit.
Right.
If they're not going to do it, we have to do something.
Yeah.
And that was the motivation that got us started.
The birth of it.
The birth of it.